Hello everyone! In today's video, I work on some FFR SC1 chassis prototypes. I install all of the new steering components onto the Firebird and do some driving, and I do a little bit more work on the Prerunner body. In a couple of previous videos, I showcased the design process of a smaller scale RC chassis. The idea was to incorporate a lot of the same components that I'm using on the Firebird build, but instead of mounting all the individual components onto the model kit's chassis, such as what I'm doing on that project, instead create a chassis that is designed around certain components and would allow a model kit's body to be mounted onto it. In addition, I wanted the main chassis piece to be designed in a way which would allow it to easily be printed on a typical FDM 3D printer. With the design and some preliminary prototyping and testing completed, I was ready to begin assembling some complete chassis. After printing out all of the components, I needed to start by removing all of the support material. I next use the correct size drill bits to bore the holes so that they are the right diameter. I also test fit all the pieces and did a little bit of sanding to ensure that everything would fit together snug. To make this chassis as solid as possible, I did use some super glue to secure each piece, along with the 5 screws. The addition of the super glue eliminates any wiggling between the individual pieces, making the overall chassis very stiff, which will provide a great platform to mount everything to. I placed the 2 bodies I'll be using with this chassis design over top to see how they fit and what adjustments will need to be made. After taking note of that, I measured the wheelbase of each of the bodies. With these measurements, I adjusted the design accordingly and printed out the variants of the chassis that are the correct size for each body. I repeated the process of removing the support material, boring the holes, and then assembling each chassis. Once complete, I test fit each chassis to ensure that it is the correct size for each body. With the main chassis pieces assembled, I turned my attention to the front suspension assembly. As I've discussed before, I wanted the steering and front suspension to be combined into a sort of modular assembly, very similar to what I did on the chassis I used for the Subaru. I ended up assembling several prototypes of this steering and suspension assembly, the first of which I'm building here. As I built and tested the assembly, I took note of any slop between different parts, and any design changes that I wanted to make. This first prototype that I assembled functioned very well and demonstrated a lot of potential for this design, though there were a few things that I wanted to change, such as the design of the steering linkage. I also decided to make the ball ends of the ball and socket joints a part of the piece rather than being separate and secured to the part using small fasteners. Having these small metal ball joints is a nice option because they are smooth and consistent in size, so I'll probably still experiment with having them, but I found them to be very hard to install, being so tiny, so the following prototypes have the ball ends as a part of the printed piece. But this first prototype ended up being a very good start in demonstrating the potential for this front suspension setup. For the second version, I made a number of changes to the design of the individual parts. As I just mentioned, the ball ends of the sockets are now printed along with the part, and I also made a number of changes to the steering linkage. As I was assembling all of these parts, I wanted to make sure that I sanded any spots that needed it, and ran a drill bit through all the holes to ensure that they were the right size, so that everything would fit as intended. Doing all of this finishing work is especially important when assembling components that are this small and from parts that are 3D printed. I started by mounting the lower control arms to the main piece. After that, I moved on to assembling the steering knuckles. Although I like the design of these steering knuckles, utilizing only one bearing caused the wheel axle to have a lot of play, which I will address later with the third version. These redesigned steering arms are much stronger than the previous ones and hold the center link up higher since the tie rods now mount to the top side of each arm. Assembling these steering parts is much easier than the previous since the tiny ball ends of the sockets don't need to be mounted separately. I then attached the outer tie rod ends to the knuckles and mounted all of the components. Next, I secured the upper part of the struts into each upper strut mount. I've found that using thinner oil rather than grease does a great job of lubricating the ball joints and allowing them to move smoothly with minimal resistance. Here I'm building the parts that will hold the upper strut mount in place. These parts are made using FDM 3D printed pieces and 2mm steel rods, which are glued and press fit into place. After the glue is dried, I attach each piece to the rest of the assembly using screws. This assembly was a significant improvement over the previous, however there were still a few things that I didn't like and I wanted to address in the third version. One of the biggest being the play in the wheel axles that I mentioned earlier, and also I noticed that all the ball joints felt a bit stiff, so I made sure to increase the gap slightly for the next version, which made a big difference as to how smoothly everything moves. Aside from the things mentioned previously, there isn't much that's different with this third version, aside from beefing up the center link since the previous one had some flex, and I added a strut bar to the top of the upper strut mounts to prevent them from moving. This is the design I'm going to be using for both the Camaro and Mustang bodies. I'm very pleased with the assembly as a whole. The suspension and steering move smoothly, the strut bar really helps to make everything feel solid, and I was able to virtually eliminate any wheel axle movement by adding a second bearing to the shaft. It's a tight squeeze to get it all to fit into the knuckle without having to make it any larger, but I was able to squeeze it all in. Of course, I will continue to be experimenting with the design. One of the limitations currently is that this setup does not allow for a ton of steering angle, and the steering arms don't provide a lot of leverage for the servo. Both of these things can easily be addressed by selecting a smaller motor, which will make more room for the steering components, allowing them to be longer and allow for a greater range of movement. I wanted to create this initial design around a relatively large RF130CH motor, since they are very common, provide plenty of power, and are very inexpensive. I also plan on using smaller size motors as well, which in the future will allow more room for the steering components. This initial prototyping phase of any new design is never the most enjoyable part of any project, at least in my opinion, though of course it is a very important and necessary step. Taking a concept from sketch to CAD and finally to a physical assembly can be both enjoyable and frustrating at the same time, since it's usually hard to take everything into account until you've actually assembled a physical component and begun testing to see how it functions. I take note of everything I want to address in the next version and make any design changes accordingly, repeating this until I'm satisfied with the result. Now that I have a design that I'm satisfied with for both of these builds, I can begin to move on to doing some more of the fun stuff like building and painting the body, and eventually doing some driving. I'm looking forward to seeing what these chassis are capable of, and seeing how they compare performance-wise to the more scale Firebirds. In a previous video, I did a bunch of work on the 1/24 scale Firebird's rear suspension, and I talked about some of the things that I wanted to do to the front. Mainly, I wanted to make it so that the front tires sit further forward in the wheel wells, and space the front wheels out just a little bit to match the new wider rear end. I started by carefully disassembling the car and removing the body and wheels. I then very carefully removed the lower control arms and disconnected the center link from the steering arms. Next, I begin to assemble the revised steering components and new lower control arms, which will place the knuckle slightly more forward and outward. These new wheel hubs are spaced out further than the previous ones, which will push the wheels out further. I did a little bit of sanding and then glued some magnets to the hubs and then mounted them onto the car. Once everything was assembled, I reinstalled the lower control arms and connected the center link to the steering arms. I printed out a new set of wheels with more back spacing that will be mounted onto the back, since as I mentioned in a previous video, I felt that wider rear wheels would look better after increasing the spacing in the rear. I started by doing a little bit of post-print sanding. Since I will be painting all of the wheels, I removed all the tires by using a tire removing tool and gently tapping. I will also be painting the fender flares as well. All of the flares required a little bit of trimming and sanding before painting. I did this carefully since these are fragile parts with some fine details. I test fit each piece to make sure that they fit snug against the body. I decided to paint the wheels gloss black and the fender flares flat black. I didn't apply the paint too thick so I could preserve some of the finer details. I applied light coats until all of the parts were fully covered. Most of the tires press fit on snug, but for a few that were a bit loose, I used some water washable glue to help make them stick. The wheels looked good before, but they look even better now after being painted. I reinstalled all the wheels and checked to see where the tires will rub against the chassis. I made any modifications as necessary to prevent any rubbing. After that, I reinstalled the body and once again checked to see if the tires will rub. The position of the front wheels is much better than what it was before with the new lower control arms installed. I might still space the front wheels out just a little bit further to try and better match the rear. But with everything back together, I went ahead and did a little bit of driving to see how everything was working. The alignment seems to be better than it was before, and I didn't notice any wheel rubbing while driving. Everything seems to be functioning well, and I didn't encounter any issues. Although I will continue to be messing around with the suspension and steering, overall I'm happy with where the car is at right now, and I'm going to start focusing more on the cosmetic aspects of the car, which I'm really looking forward to getting started on. I was able to make a little bit of progress on the 72 Chevy Prerunner build. I've been making quite a bit of progress lately, which I showcased in the previous video. With all the bodywork and sanding that I did previously, I was eager to get a coat of primer laid down and see how these sections are looking. Upon closer inspection, I noticed a few sections of the cage where the paint seemed a bit thin. Although these sections probably won't be noticed, I decided to apply a bit more paint. With these sections being 3D printed, more layers of paint will also help to give the surface a more smooth finish. I then did some final sanding around the hood vents. I noticed a spot that I wanted to add a little bit of putty, which I let dry and then sanded smooth. Before applying primer, I wanted to cut out a chunk of the stock fenders, since I will be mounting much larger fender flares. I started by taping the fender flare in place, and then I marked roughly where I wanted to make the cut. After determining where I wanted to make the cuts, I used a rotary tool to remove these sections of the body. I thought that after removing this much material from the body, that some structural reinforcement would be necessary to keep the body rigid. However, since the body is made from thick polycarbonate, it is still very rigid even after removing this much material. Now with these sections removed, I was ready to apply the first coat of primer. Aside from the sections where I did a lot of sanding and filling, I wanted to make sure the primer is kept relatively light, so I don't lose any of the details such as the panel gaps. The body looks great now that it is all one color. There's just a few spots that I feel need a little bit more work before painting, but overall it's looking great. As always, I want to showcase some of the awesome work that has been posted to the Make It RC Facebook group. There's been so many awesome vehicles showcased over these past few weeks. What you're seeing here is just the tip of the iceberg. I always enjoy seeing the builds and projects you all have been posting. It's certainly been a busy past several weeks for me, hence the lack of uploads recently. Among other things, myself and a few friends have been doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes, including website work, and getting the first round of MA10 axles and other related small-scale RC components shipped out to customers. None of these items are yet on the online store page, but they will be soon. The supplies are very limited right now, as this is just the first small-scale production run. Also, the variety of components will be quite limited in the beginning. We're hoping to gradually increase the number of variations and different products available as time goes on. I appreciate everyone's patience, and I want to give a huge thank you to everybody who has been shopping at the Make It RC store. Even with just the limited selection of products currently available, you all have been giving so much support by purchasing the products. The feedback has been very positive, and I always enjoy seeing how everybody has been utilizing these products on your builds. I anticipate things are probably going to remain quite busy moving forward into the coming weeks. However, I will be doing my best to get some quality videos uploaded as often as I can. Of course, as always, you can follow me at the social media links below for more frequent updates. I've also been using the community tab here on YouTube to post more frequent updates. However, it seems to have stopped working over this past week to where I can't post anything, but once that starts working again, I'll be sure to get back to posting there as well. Anyways, thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.